Ground that airplane immediately. That was the first line of the notice Karen Whitmore sent me at 6:12 on a Tuesday morning, and it was the last thing I expected to read before breakfast. My crop duster was scheduled to fly over 2,300 acres that morning, and the HOA president had decided that a neighborhood rule gave her the authority to stop it. I did not argue with her. I printed the notice, saved the email, and called Daniel Brooks, my attorney. By 7 o'clock, we had already identified 3 separate claims in Karen's letter. She called the aircraft a neighborhood nuisance, cited concerns about low-altitude operations, and demanded that I suspend all agricultural flights until the HOA board could review the matter. None of those claims explained how an HOA could ground an aircraft operating from my farm. I had owned the property for years, and the crop duster was part of a normal agricultural operation that had been scheduled long before Karen's letter appeared. What bothered me was not the demand itself. It was the timing. The weather forecast showed only a narrow window for the work. If I missed it, I could lose several days before conditions were suitable again, and the crops would not wait for an HOA meeting. Daniel asked me to send him every document connected to the aircraft, the farm, and the HOA complaint. I opened the folder and started scanning everything. At 7:42, Daniel called back. "Michael, this complaint was not written this morning." I looked at the timestamp. Karen had prepared the first draft 4 days earlier. That meant she had known about the planned flight before she claimed the aircraft had suddenly become a problem. I opened the HOA records next. There was no prior violation notice involving the crop duster. No hearing. No board vote. No recorded rules specifically addressing agricultural aircraft operating from private farmland. Then I found something even stranger. Karen had copied an outside address on the original complaint. It was not another homeowner. It was an agricultural office in the county. Daniel told me not to contact anyone until we understood the paperwork. So I did what I had learned to do whenever someone tried to turn an assumption into authority. I followed the documents. At 8:15, I called the county agricultural coordinator, Ethan Cole. He recognized my farm immediately. When I explained what the HOA had done, he became quiet for several seconds. Then he said, "Michael, before you respond to that letter, check the paperwork for the aircraft assignment." I asked what he meant. He would not explain over the phone. He only told me to look at the federal records connected to the current agricultural operation. I pulled the folder from my office cabinet. It contained flight schedules, agricultural records, maintenance paperwork, and one contract I had almost forgotten about because it had been handled months earlier. I opened the first page and stopped. The aircraft was not simply working for my farm. It was operating under a federal agricultural program. I read the contract number twice. Then I looked back at Karen's grounding order. She had spent 4 days preparing a demand against an aircraft she apparently knew very little about. The question was no longer whether the HOA disliked my crop duster. The question was why Karen had been so determined to stop a flight that was connected to a federal agricultural contract. And I had a feeling the answer was buried in the documents she never mentioned. By 9 o'clock that morning, I had 3 questions and no intention of guessing at the answers. Why had Karen prepared the complaint 4 days early? Why had she contacted the county agricultural office before sending the grounding demand? And why did an ordinary HOA dispute suddenly involve a federal agricultural contract? Daniel told me to stay focused on the records, so I opened every file connected to the aircraft. The first documents showed exactly what I expected: aircraft registration, maintenance records, pilot information, farm treatment schedules, and the operational plan for the current season. Then I reached the contract Ethan had mentioned. It was legitimate, active, and tied to agricultural work that extended beyond my own property. I read the scope twice. The crop duster was not being used for sightseeing, personal transportation, or recreational flying. It had been assigned to agricultural operations under a federal program. I sent Daniel a copy. His response came within minutes. This changes the nature of the complaint. I asked him whether the HOA could still raise legitimate safety concerns. He said they could raise concerns, But that was different from having authority to ground an aircraft or interfere with a lawful operation. That distinction mattered. I did not want to pretend the federal contract made me immune from every local rule. I wanted to know exactly where the HOA's authority ended. Daniel suggested we compare Karen's complaint with the actual HOA governing documents. We pulled the declaration, community rules, enforcement policy, and every amendment that mentioned aircraft, agricultural activity, noise, or private property. The result was surprisingly thin. There were general nuisance provisions, but nothing that clearly gave the HOA authority over agricultural aircraft operating from private farmland. Then Daniel noticed something I had missed. Karen's complaint described my aircraft as operating within the residential community. My farm was adjacent to the community, but the runway and agricultural fields were outside the HOA's recorded boundaries. That was the first major inconsistency. I opened the county parcel map and placed it beside the HOA map. The difference was obvious. My farm touched the neighborhood, but it was not part of it. Karen had described the aircraft as though the entire operation occurred inside the association's jurisdiction. Daniel told me that one inaccurate description could explain a lot, but it did not explain why she had prepared the complaint days in advance. So we kept digging. At 10:18, Ethan called me back. He said he had reviewed the federal program file and confirmed that the agricultural operation was active. Then he added something I had not expected. "Michael, the county received a copy of the HOA complaint before you did." I asked who had sent it. He said the document came directly from Karen's office. That meant Karen had not simply reacted to a flight. She had already begun building an administrative record around it. Daniel told me to preserve every message and avoid making any statement that could be misunderstood. I agreed. Then another email arrived from the HOA. Karen had scheduled an emergency board meeting for Friday evening and demanded that I attend with documentation proving that the aircraft was authorized to operate. I stared at the deadline. It was less than 72 hours away. The weather window was closing, the HOA meeting was approaching, and the federal contract was still only partially understood. But the most important question had just changed. Karen was no longer asking me to stop the aircraft temporarily. She was demanding that I prove why she could not stop it. And I knew exactly where I needed to look next, the federal file behind that contract. By Wednesday morning, the emergency HOA meeting had become the countdown that mattered most. I had less than 72 hours to prepare, but the weather window for the agricultural work was narrowing even faster. I could not afford to let the dispute consume the time the crops needed, so I stopped treating Karen's letter as an argument and started treating it as a record. Daniel and I drove to the county agricultural office with copies of the HOA complaint, the parcel maps, and the federal contract information. Ethan Cole met us with a file already open on his desk. "There is something you need to understand," he said. "The county did not authorize your aircraft to operate under the federal program, but we coordinate with the agencies that do." He showed me the agricultural service schedule. My farm was listed alongside several other participating properties, and the crop duster was assigned to a specific operational window based on crop conditions and weather. That explained why Ethan had sounded concerned when I mentioned the HOA grounding order. The timing was not flexible. If the work was delayed beyond the scheduled window, the next suitable opportunity could be several days away. I asked whether the HOA had any role in approving the agricultural schedule. Ethan shook his head. "Not from what I see here." That answer gave me some relief, but it also created a bigger question. Why had Karen contacted the county before contacting me? Daniel asked whether the county had received any supporting material with the complaint. Ethan pulled out the original submission. It contained Karen's letter, a community map, several photographs of aircraft activity, and a statement claiming that the operation was taking place inside the residential association's boundaries. Daniel immediately compared the map with the county parcel record. The agricultural fields were outside the HOA boundary. Then he noticed the photographs. They were taken from a road bordering the neighborhood, but none showed the actual flight path over my fields. "They are presenting proximity as jurisdiction," Daniel said. I nodded. That was becoming a pattern. The complaint was not necessarily fabricated, but key details were being presented in a way that made the HOA's authority appear broader than it was. Before we left, Ethan gave me one more piece of information. The federal contract had a designated project contact, and that person had already received the HOA complaint. I asked whether anyone from the federal program had responded. Ethan said no, but he expected they would once they reviewed the submission. On the drive home, Daniel received another message from Karen. The emergency meeting agenda had been updated. The first item was no longer simply aircraft nuisance. It now read, Review of unauthorized agricultural flight activity and community safety. I read it twice. Unauthorized. That word mattered. Karen was no longer asking whether the flight was acceptable. She had already labeled it unauthorized before the board had reviewed the evidence. Daniel told me we needed to bring the federal paperwork to the meeting, but I decided to do more. I wanted the board to see the entire chain of records, not just the contract. We prepared the aircraft documents, agricultural schedule, county parcel map, HOA declaration, complaint, and every email exchange since Karen's first notice. Then, just before sunset, I opened the federal file again. Behind the contract was a page I had not noticed before. It listed the official purpose of the agricultural operation and the agency responsible for oversight. My stomach tightened when I saw the next line. The program had already received Karen's complaint. The HOA President had not simply challenged my aircraft. She had taken her claim directly into a federal administrative process. And by Friday night, the board would have to explain exactly why. By Friday afternoon, I had stopped wondering whether Karen understood the federal contract. The real question was whether the HOA board understood what she had already told the federal program. Daniel and I arrived at the clubhouse with 2 binders, a laptop, and copies of every document we had collected. I did not want to make a speech. I wanted the board to see the timeline for themselves. The emergency meeting room was already full when we walked in. Karen sat at the front table with several board members, including Susan Miller, who had reviewed the parcel records earlier that week. Karen looked confident. We are here to address an unauthorized agricultural flight operation, she announced. I placed my first binder on the table. Then we should start by defining unauthorized. The board chair asked me to explain. I opened the county parcel map and showed the boundary of the HOA. My runway and agricultural fields were outside it. Then I placed Karen's complaint beside the map. Her letter described the flight activity as occurring within the community. Susan leaned closer to the documents. That statement does not match the county map, she said. Karen replied that the aircraft operated close enough to affect residents. Daniel answered that proximity and jurisdiction were not the same thing. Then I opened the agricultural schedule. The crop duster had been assigned to a specific operation based on crop conditions and weather. The board chair asked whether the schedule came from the federal program. I nodded and handed him the contract. Karen immediately objected that the HOA had never approved the operation. Daniel calmly explained that the contract did not depend on HOA approval because the agricultural fields were outside the association's recorded boundaries. The room became quiet. Then Karen revealed something I had not expected. She had known about the federal contract before sending the grounding demand. She said a county contact had mentioned that my aircraft was connected to an agricultural program. I asked why that information was absent from her complaint. She said the federal connection did not change her concerns about safety. Daniel asked whether she had notified the board before contacting the federal program. Karen said she had informed the board through email. Susan immediately asked to see that email. Karen hesitated. The board chair requested a copy. A few minutes later, the message appeared on the screen. It was short, but one sentence stood out. Karen had written that the HOA needed to establish control over the flight activity before the federal agency became involved. I read it again. The room changed instantly. The issue was no longer simply safety. Karen had described the federal program as something the HOA needed to get ahead of. Susan asked why. Karen said she was trying to protect the community. Then Daniel opened another document. It was the response from the federal program contact, received that morning. The message stated that the agricultural operation was active and properly documented, and that any concerns about the federal contract should be directed through the designated program process rather than treated as an HOA enforcement matter. The board chair looked at Karen. "Did you receive this response?" She nodded. Then he asked the question nobody expected. "If you knew this operation was under a federal agricultural program, why did the grounding order say it was unauthorized?" Karen had no immediate answer. I watched the board members look at one another. Then Susan opened the original HOA declaration and found another clause that changed the situation again. It required the board to verify property boundaries before taking enforcement action affecting land outside the association. The rule Karen had used against me contained a limitation she had apparently overlooked. And now the board had to decide whether the grounding demand had violated its own procedures. The HOA had already decided what my crop duster was before the board even saw the federal paperwork. That was the part one could not ignore. By Saturday morning, the emergency meeting had turned into something much larger than a dispute about aircraft noise. Karen's own email had shown that she wanted the HOA to establish control before the federal agency became involved, and now the board had to explain why. Daniel and I stayed at the clubhouse after the meeting while Susan Miller gathered the original records. She had found another section of the governing documents that required the board to verify property boundaries before enforcing a rule against land outside the association. "This changes the procedure," Susan said. I agreed, but Daniel was already looking at the next problem. Karen's complaint had been sent to the federal program before the board had formally reviewed the evidence. If the complaint contained inaccurate information, the federal office needed to receive the corrected record directly. I called the designated program contact listed in my contract. A woman named Rachel Morgan answered and confirmed that the file was under review. She asked me to send the original contract, the county parcel map, the aircraft schedule, and the HOA complaint exactly as received. I sent everything without changing a single page. 2 hours later, Rachel called back. Her first question surprised me. "Why does the HOA complaint say the aircraft operation occurs inside the residential association?" I told her the runway and fields were outside the recorded HOA boundary. She paused. "Then that statement needs to be corrected." Daniel asked whether the federal program could simply disregard the complaint. Rachel said the agency would evaluate the documents independently, but an inaccurate jurisdictional claim could affect how the complaint was understood. That was exactly what I wanted. Not special treatment. Not influence. Just the complete record. Then Rachel mentioned something neither Karen nor the board had disclosed. The federal program had received an earlier inquiry about agricultural flights near the community. That inquiry had come from a development consultant, not Karen. Daniel immediately asked for the date. Rachel gave it to him. It was 9 days before Karen's first complaint. We checked the HOA records. The consultant's name appeared in an email Karen had forwarded to the board. The message described concerns about aircraft activity and recommended that the HOA seek a restriction before the upcoming development review. I read the sentence twice. The grounding demand suddenly had a different context. Someone had been trying to restrict agricultural flights before the development review even began. Daniel pulled up the county planning calendar. The development review was scheduled for the following week. The timing was too close to dismiss. Susan looked at the email and quietly said, "So this was never just about noise." I did not answer. I was thinking about the flight schedule, the federal contract, and the deadline approaching for the agricultural work. Then Daniel opened the development proposal. A new residential section was planned along the eastern edge of my farm. The proposed homes would sit closer to the existing agricultural flight corridor than the current neighborhood did. Suddenly, the HOA's urgency made sense. They were not simply trying to stop one flight. They were trying to establish a restriction before the new development was reviewed. And if that was true, Karen had not been protecting an existing neighborhood rule. She had been trying to create a new obstacle for an agricultural operation that had already been documented and approved under a federal program. By Sunday evening, the situation had changed again. The HOA was no longer dealing with an aircraft complaint. It was now facing questions about why it had tried to restrict an agricultural operation before a nearby development review had even begun. Daniel had spent most of the afternoon organizing the timeline, and when he placed the documents across my kitchen table, the pattern was difficult to ignore. The developer's consultant had contacted the federal program 9 days before Karen's first complaint. Karen had then received information about the concern, prepared her own complaint, and described my aircraft operation as unauthorized even though the farmland was outside the HOA boundary. The federal contract had existed before any of this began. The agricultural schedule had existed before the complaint. Nothing about the operation had suddenly changed. The only thing that changed was the HOA's interest in stopping it. I called Rachel Morgan again and asked whether the federal program had any objection to the county development review moving forward while the complaint was being evaluated. She said the federal agency would not make a local land use decision, but the agricultural contract remained active unless the proper agency process determined otherwise. That answer was important because it meant the HOA could not simply treat its own complaint as a federal decision. Daniel told me to document everything and continue following the contract requirements exactly. The next morning, I received a new message from Karen. She said the board was willing to reconsider the grounding demand if I agreed to a temporary restriction on flight operations near the community. I read the proposal carefully. It was not a simple safety agreement. The restriction covered an area that extended beyond the HOA boundary and included part of my agricultural land. It also had no clear expiration date. I sent the proposal to Daniel. He called me 5 minutes later. "Do not sign this," he said. "They are trying to turn a temporary complaint into a permanent restriction." I asked what he thought their real objective was. He told me to look at the attached map. I opened it and immediately recognized the proposed development boundary. The restricted flight area overlapped the same section of land identified in the developer's planning documents. That was the missing connection. The HOA restriction would make the proposed residential expansion easier to approve because the aircraft activity would appear to be reduced before the planning review. Karen was not simply asking me to be considerate of the neighbors. She was asking me to accept a restriction that could change how my agricultural operation was viewed during another party's development process. I decided not to respond directly. Instead, Daniel prepared a factual response listing the recorded property boundaries, the active agricultural contract, the existing flight schedule, and the absence of any HOA authority over the affected farmland. We sent the response to the board and copied the appropriate county contact. Then Susan called me. Her voice was quieter than usual. She had found something inside the HOA archive that Karen had not mentioned. It was an old board memorandum from the original development approval. The memorandum specifically stated that agricultural operations existed along the eastern boundary, and that future residential planning should account for those operations. Susan said the document was more than 20 years old. I asked why it mattered. She answered, "Because the board already knew the agricultural activity was there before the current neighborhood was built." I looked at the timeline again. The HOA had not discovered an unexpected aircraft operation. The community had been built beside an established agricultural operation. And now someone was trying to make that operation look like the new problem. Susan paused before adding one final sentence. "There is also a signature on this memorandum." She would not tell me whose signature it was over the phone. She said I needed to see the original at the next board meeting. And suddenly, the most important document in the entire dispute was no longer the federal contract. It was the 20-year-old paper that could prove exactly what the HOA had known from the beginning. The signature belonged to the original HOA board chair, and when I finally saw it on Monday evening, I understood why Susan had sounded so careful on the phone. The memorandum was dated 23 years earlier, long before Karen became president, and before most of the current board members had moved into the neighborhood. At the bottom was a simple statement confirming that agricultural operations existed along the eastern boundary and that future residential planning should account for them. The signature belonged to the HOA's founding board chair. More importantly, the memorandum had been included in the original development approval records. I looked at Daniel. So they knew. He nodded. They knew before the first house was built. That changed the entire dispute. The current HOA was treating my crop duster as though it were a new activity that had suddenly appeared beside the neighborhood. The archive showed the opposite. Agricultural operations were part of the original surroundings, and the community had been approved with that knowledge. Susan turned to another page. It contained a handwritten note from the county planner who reviewed the original development proposal. The note stated that residential construction should not be represented as eliminating established agricultural activity. I read the sentence twice. Karen was sitting across the room with the rest of the board. Her expression had changed. She was no longer looking at the documents as though they were technical details. She was looking at a history she could not easily explain away. The board chair asked whether the memorandum had ever been formally replaced. Susan checked the archive. There was no replacement document. Daniel explained that did not automatically settle every current legal question, but it established something important about what the original community knew and accepted. Then Karen spoke. She said the current board had a responsibility to protect residents from aircraft activity that had become more noticeable over the years. I agreed that legitimate concerns could be reviewed. Then I asked one question. Why was the federal contract described as unauthorized before the board reviewed it? Karen said she believed the aircraft operation had expanded beyond what the original community expected. I asked whether she had evidence of that expansion. She did not have an answer. Daniel placed the current agricultural schedule beside the older development memorandum. The flight activity was still connected to agricultural land along the same eastern boundary described in the original records. Nothing had suddenly appeared. The board chair then asked Karen about the developer's consultant. She admitted that the consultant had contacted her about aircraft concerns before the grounding notice was prepared. Susan asked whether the consultant had discussed the upcoming development review. Karen said there had been conversations about future planning, but she insisted that the grounding request was independent. Daniel opened the email containing the proposed restriction. The map covered the exact corridor needed for the planned residential expansion. The room went silent again. Then the board chair asked Karen to explain why a supposedly temporary safety restriction matched the developer's proposed boundary so closely. Karen said the overlap was coincidental. Daniel did not argue. He simply placed the old memorandum beside the new map. The contrast was obvious. 23 years earlier, the community had been approved with established agricultural operations along its edge. Now the HOA was proposing a restriction that would reduce those same operations just as new development was being reviewed. Susan looked at me and said, "There is one more document." She pulled out a second folder from the archive. Inside was a letter from the original developer acknowledging the agricultural activity and agreeing that future buyers would be informed. That meant the agricultural operation was not merely known to the original board. It had been part of the development's own disclosure process. The board chair closed his eyes for a moment and then asked for a recess. Before anyone stood up, Karen received an email on her phone. She read it and immediately looked toward the developer's consultant. Daniel noticed the change. "What did they just send you?" he asked. Karen did not answer. The board chair asked her to share it with everyone. She finally placed the phone on the table. The message was from the developer's attorney, and it contained a deadline for the upcoming planning review. If the aircraft restriction was not resolved before that meeting, the development proposal could face additional scrutiny. The deadline was no longer just about my flight schedule. It was about the developer's entire project. And now the board had to decide whether it would protect its residents, follow its own history, or help a developer meet a deadline that had nothing to do with HOA authority. The planning deadline was now less than 24 hours away, and the pressure that had been directed at me was beginning to move toward the HOA board. Karen's grounding order had started as a supposed safety measure, but the records now showed a much more complicated picture. The agricultural operation was documented, the federal contract was active, the farmland was outside the HOA boundary, and the community's original development records acknowledged the agricultural activity before the first homes were built. Daniel and I returned to the clubhouse the following morning for the board's emergency review. This time, I brought only the documents that mattered. I placed the original development memorandum, the federal contract, the county parcel map, Karen's complaint, and the developer's proposed restriction on the table. Susan added the original disclosure letter from the developer. The board chair looked at the collection and said, "We need to separate what the HOA can regulate from what it cannot." Daniel agreed. He explained that legitimate neighborhood concerns could still be reviewed through the proper process, but the existing documents did not support treating my agricultural operation as an unauthorized HOA activity. Karen asked whether the federal contract gave me unlimited freedom to operate. Daniel answered carefully. No. It establishes the purpose and authorization of the agricultural work. It does not eliminate every applicable law or safety requirement. But it also does not give the HOA authority it does not otherwise possess. That distinction changed the discussion. The board chair asked Karen whether she had received the original development memorandum before issuing the grounding demand. She admitted that the document was in the HOA archive but said she had not reviewed it before preparing the complaint. Susan asked why the board had not been shown the document earlier. Karen said she had not believed it was relevant to the current issue. Daniel pointed to the developer's proposed restriction. It became relevant when the same area was identified for a new residential expansion. Nobody answered. Then the developer's consultant joined the meeting remotely. He explained that the upcoming planning review required the developer to address potential conflicts between the proposed homes and nearby agricultural operations. I asked whether the developer had requested the HOA to restrict my aircraft. He said the developer had only asked the HOA to help address community concerns. Susan asked whether the developer knew the agricultural operation existed before the expansion was proposed. The consultant admitted that the original development records were available to the planning team. That admission changed the room again. The developer was not discovering the aircraft for the first time. The proposed homes were being planned near an established agricultural operation that had been documented for more than 2 decades. The board chair asked Karen whether she would withdraw the grounding demand while the matter was reviewed properly. Karen hesitated. She said withdrawing it could make the HOA appear weak. I finally spoke. This is not about looking weak. It is about whether the order was supported in the first place. Susan nodded. The board chair then made a motion to suspend the grounding demand immediately, notified the federal program that the HOA was reviewing the matter, and obtain an independent legal opinion on the association's authority before issuing any further restriction. Karen voted against the motion. Every other board member voted in favor. The demand was suspended. For the first time in days, the pressure lifted. But the meeting was not over. The board chair asked Daniel whether there was anything else the board needed to know before contacting the county. Daniel opened one final document. It was the original development agreement, and it contained a provision requiring the developer to disclose known agricultural operations to future homeowners. That meant the community's original agreement had already accounted for the very activity Karen had described as an unexpected nuisance. Then Susan noticed a date on the developer's new planning application. It had been filed only 3 weeks before Karen's first complaint. The timing was unmistakable. The HOA grounding demand had appeared immediately after the expansion application entered review. The board chair looked at the documents and said, "We need to know whether our association was used to solve someone else's development problem." Nobody responded. Karen stared at the table. The independent attorney was scheduled to review the records that afternoon. Until then, the grounding demand was suspended, but the larger question remained. If the HOA had been pushed into restricting my agricultural operation for the developer's benefit, someone was going to have to explain exactly how that decision was made. The attorney's answer arrived at 2:17 on Monday afternoon, and it settled the question that had been hanging over the entire dispute. The HOA had no authority to impose the proposed flight restriction on my farmland. The original development records, the recorded property boundaries, the federal agricultural contract, and the association's own governing documents all pointed in the same direction. Daniel called me immediately after receiving the legal opinion. "Michael, they crossed their own boundary before they ever established yours." I knew exactly what he meant. The HOA had issued a grounding demand against an operation outside its jurisdiction, described that operation as unauthorized, and then tried to convert the demand into a broader restriction that matched a developer's proposed expansion area. The evidence was now too clear to ignore. That evening, the board held its final review before the county planning meeting. Karen attended, but she no longer controlled the conversation. Susan presented the 23-year-old development memorandum first. Then she presented the original developer disclosure confirming that agricultural operations existed along the eastern boundary. Daniel followed with the county parcel map and federal contract. Finally, the board chair displayed the developer's proposed restriction beside the planning application. The overlap was exact. The restriction would have reduced agricultural flight activity across the same corridor needed for the new residential expansion. The developer's consultant admitted that the restriction would have made the planning review easier. That statement changed everything. The board chair asked Karen whether she had known that before issuing the grounding demand. Karen said she had been aware of the development plans but denied acting on the developer's behalf. Susan then opened Karen's earlier email requesting that the HOA establish control before the federal agency became involved. The room went silent. The independent attorney explained that the board could not use its authority to accomplish an objective outside its governing documents, especially when the affected property was outside the association's recorded boundaries. The board chair asked for a motion. Susan moved to permanently withdraw the grounding demand, correct the HOA's prior statement to the Federal Agricultural Program, and notify the county that the association had no objection to the documented agricultural operation continuing under applicable laws and program requirements. The motion passed unanimously. Karen did not vote against it this time. She simply sat quietly as the board corrected the record she had created. The next morning, I received confirmation from the federal program that the complaint had been closed with no action against my agricultural operation. The county planning office also confirmed that the development review would proceed based on the actual property records and existing agricultural activity, not on an HOA restriction that had never been validly established. I finally had the answer I had been looking for since that first letter arrived. The crop duster had never been the real problem. The problem was an attempt to make an existing agricultural operation appear unauthorized so someone else's future development would face fewer complications. The HOA had tried to use its authority beyond its boundaries, and the records had stopped it. A week later, the board adopted a new verification policy requiring property boundaries, historical agreements, and outside agency documents to be reviewed before enforcement action could affect land beyond the association. Karen resigned as HOA President before the next monthly meeting. The developer revised its planning proposal and acknowledged the agricultural corridor in the new application. My crop duster returned to its scheduled work, and the farm continued operating as it had for years. I never needed to threaten anyone, fight anyone, or bend a single rule. I only needed the records to speak for themselves. And the lesson stayed with me. When an organization starts treating its assumptions like property rights, the fastest way to stop it is not to argue louder. It is to find the document that proves where its authority actually ends.